Good evening. Welcome to the 11th Economic Outlook Conference at Ohio Wesleyan University. My name is Alice Simon, and I am very, very pleased to welcome all of you. We have representatives in the room today from the Delaware community, the Columbus community, the academic community. We have students and faculty, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to what should be a very exciting evening about the future of the economy locally, globally, and nationally. It's my pleasure to introduce to you at this time the president of the institution, Dr. Rock Jones.
Thank you, Alice, and good evening. It's always a pleasure to welcome you to this event that occurs each year that is one of a number of events sponsored by the Voltimati Center for Economics, Business, and Entrepreneurship here on the campus of Ohio Wesleyan. I want to thank Dr. Alice Simon, who serves as the faculty director of the Voltimati Center, for the leadership that she and her colleagues in the Department of Economics provide in establishing the various programs that create opportunities for our students, but also create opportunities for people from within the community to join us for a time of learning and for conversation together. And none of those is more important or more eagerly anticipated than the annual Economic Outlook Conference, which, as Alice said, enters its 11th year this evening. So we welcome you. I hope that you will watch for announcements of other events hosted by the Voltimati Center as the year progresses. The Milligan Leader in Business lecture series each year, the Heisler Ethics in Business lecture series. There is now a lecture series related to environmental issues in the business and economic sector. And there are other events that come from time to time to which we always welcome those from within the community. Our panel this evening will be moderated by Dr. Goran Skospels, Associate Professor of Economics here at Ohio Wesleyan. Dr. Skospels joined our faculty in 2006, so has been with us now for nearly a decade. He completed his undergraduate work at Lake Forest College and earned 2 graduate degrees, a master's and his PhD from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. His areas of interest include economics of transition, macroeconomics, developmental economics, international economics, research methods, and economic principles. His research deals with institutional changes in post-communist countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, in banking and credit, and in small business finance. He has now for several years served as the moderator for this panel, and it's my pleasure to introduce him, and he then will introduce the panelists and conduct the discussion. Dr. Skospels.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm glad you can join us for what I believe is going to be a very, very nice evening of economics and fun. Or that's the same thing, isn't it? Economics is fun. My students tell me that economics is a lot of fun. We have 3 very distinguished guests with us today. 2 of them have been with us before. They've impressed us tremendously, so we asked them before, and we hope that the new one will come again at the future event. So the new person that has not presented yet is Ben Ayers, who is a senior economist with Nationwide Economics, and he analyzes enterprise business drivers and strategic planning processes. He currently authors Weekly Economic Outlook and Review and is a frequent presenter at Nationwide Economic Forecasts. Prior to serving there at Nationwide, he has been with the Citi Hedge Fund, Services North America, and he holds a master's degree in economics from The Ohio State University. Our second presenter is Mr. George Makerzan, who was here, if I recall correctly, in 2011. He is the Director of Economics for Huntington Trust and Huntington National Bank, and he provides economic analysis to management and clients by giving them insights on the global and local economies. He's also a panelist for the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia, and prior to Huntington, he was chair of the Economic Advisory Committee of the American Bankers Association and was the senior economist covering Australia and New Zealand, a very special place in the world, in my heart. and he earned his doctorate in economics from Duke in 1990. The third presenter is Mr. Mark Schweitzer, who is the Senior Vice President of External Outreach and Regional Analytics at the Cleveland Federal Reserve Bank. Currently, he is responsible for overseeing the bank's public outreach activities and analysis of regional economic conditions. His own research has focused on the macroeconomic impact of labor market developments and the factors contributing to regional economic growth. He has held other positions at the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City's Denver branch, and he earned his doctorate from UCLA. Please welcome, join me in welcoming our guests and what I hope is going to be a wonderful evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Goran. Good evening. Appreciate you all having me out here tonight. It's always great to see so many folks interested in economics. Don't worry, the pop quiz will be very short. It's at the end. No worries about that. I'm responsible for presenting a national outlook. I'm part of Nationwide Economics, which is a subcomponent of Nationwide Insurance. We do forecasts. We call them guesses. We try to call them as hopefully as accurate as possible. So I'll go through kind of a high-level look at what the national economy is looking at GDP, looking at job growth, looking at inflation, all those big heavy hitters from an economic perspective, and looking a little ahead as far as what we feel is going to happen over the next couple of years, and ending up with where we feel rates are going and where we feel that ultimately where the Fed will go with their rates and with their policy decisions in the next couple of years. So first slide, I'm an economist. Many people in this room are economists. We're required to start with GDP. This is the first slide we always have to show. What this slide shows here is the year-over-year growth in real GDP versus core GDP. And I think two of the main takeaways I want to pull out here is, really GDP growth right now is not very robust. The GDP growth during this entire expansion has been pretty, I would say, weak. The entire expansion, if you look back to the past couple expansions, doing pretty weak. But in recent times, we've seen a little bit of an increase in core growth. Core growth, which kind of strips out the impact of foreign trade flows and particularly strips out the impact from government. What we're seeing is that, as what's happened in the past couple cycles, as we get later on in the cycle, the core growth has picked up and gone stronger than overall GDP growth, and that's because we've seen a drag because of the higher dollar and because of cuts in government spending. And so the core economy is doing pretty well, pretty solidly. Yet again, solid growth, not great. The long-term average for real GDP growth is about 3%. For this year, we're expecting GDP growth of about 2.5%. So still, yet again, as with every year in this expansion, not reaching that long-term average for GDP growth. But fortunately, in the last year to year and a half, we've seen the economy really switch from what was originally a manufacturing-driven and a manufacturing and a production-driven economy, really shifting over to a consumer-driven economy. And with consumer spending about 70% of GDP, as consumers go, so goes the economy. And we're expecting a modest acceleration in GDP growth through the rest of this year and then into 2016. The expectations we have for growth for next year, about 3%. So yet again, good, not great growth, but still picking up into the strongest growth we've seen throughout this expansion. One of the key trends we're keeping on is productivity growth. That's been one of the main reasons why we're not seeing faster GDP growth from the economy as a whole. As we expect trends, as we expect labor costs to go up in the next couple of years, we should see some pickup in productivity, and that'll help push us to a faster rate of growth for the overall economy as well. But the main thing is it's very consumer-driven right now, and the main driver of that is job growth. Looking at job growth now, the labor market's doing very well. If you look at all the indicators from the labor market, we're about the strongest labor market we've seen since the late 1990s. We've had 2 consecutive years now of plus 200,000 jobs per month average for job growth. When you add all that up, that's a lot of job gains, that's a lot of job growth and a lot of momentum for the economy, pushing us faster and pushing a lot of consumer-driven activity to a higher pace of growth. When you look at the job growth, the reason why we're so focused on job growth, because we view it as the start of a cycle. If you have job growth, you have more income growth, as people have more jobs and more income. As people have more income, they're going to spend more money, and as people spend more money and have a faster pace of consumer activity, that leads to more corporate profits. As corporate profits go faster, guess what? They're going to add more jobs. And it really starts a cycle, a positive feedback loop that right now is spinning pretty rapidly. It's the main driver of growth that we're seeing going on. And as consumers go, like I said, yet again, so goes the economy. The blue lines here, those are your job gains. And yet again, as I said, we've averaged about 200,000 jobs over the past 24 months. And that's a very, very robust rate for the labor market and tells us things are tightening up from a labor market perspective. We're getting back to what we'd like to see for the labor market and moving in a much more positive direction. The orange line here, that's your unemployment rate. Last month, we reached 5.0% for the first time of this expansion, the lowest rate we've seen since April of 2008. And that's yet again another positive sign from the labor market. Most estimates of what we call full unemployment and full employment is about 5%. Maybe it's a little lower than 5%, but that tells us yet again labor market's getting back to where it's supposed to be, getting back to where it's driving growth stronger and driving things in a much more positive direction. Two more things we definitely look at from a labor market perspective is indicators of how tight the labor market is. That means how tight and how more or difficult it is for people to get jobs. Right now, initial jobless claims are about the 40-year low. That's another sign that things are tightening up from a labor market perspective. They're going to move us in a positive direction. And also, just last month with the very blowout jobs report that we got for October, finally saw an increase in wage growth. The reason we look at wage growth, because usually it's an early indicator of where inflation is going to go. As wage growth goes, so goes inflation, usually 6 to 12 months down the line. And wage growth, we finally got a pop last month, pushed wage growth up to 2.5% over the past year, which is the strongest rate of the expansion. And yet again, reiterating the point, telling us that we have a much tighter labor market, much more stronger conditions from the labor market perspective, and one of the main reasons why we feel that the Fed's going to start moving with rates and starting to slow down the economy. So I did look at things from a national perspective. I do want to show a chart here which shows job growth over the past year across the entire country. As you can see, green is good, red is bad. And what we see here is across the majority of the country, things are looking pretty good from a job growth perspective. And that tells us it's a pretty widespread recovery, pretty widespread growth across most of the country. The West Coast does see some stronger growth rates compared to the East Coast, but still, most everyone's green. But one of the things we've seen recently has been a pullback in job growth, mainly because of the energy sector. Obviously, we've had much lower energy prices since about, almost a whole year ago now, we've had energy prices much lower than we've seen in recent years. And that's impacting job growth finally in some of these key states. You're looking at North Dakota there, you're looking at Texas, which was growing about 4% clip just 6 to 7 months ago over the past years, now down to 1.9, and obviously West Virginia as well. But the key trend here is, even though there are a few localized areas of concern because of pullbacks in the energy sector, across the board, it's definitely a positive for the economy, and yet another contributing factor boosting consumer spending power, another reason why we're again so positive where growth trends are going and where things should be going forward. Final macroeconomic indicator I'll hit on is inflation. Everyone concerned about inflation, but right now, inflation is very tepid. As you look at the blue line here, which is your overall 12-month inflation rate, right about 0. And this is actually including the number we got this morning, which bumped it up just a little bit. Very slow overall inflation, but that's mainly driven by energy prices. And those things move around very rapidly, shift around very rapidly with energy prices. What we're concerned about, and really what the Fed looks at when they're making their policy decisions, is the core rate. If you're looking at the core rate, which strips out those very volatile food and energy components, those components which the Fed cannot really control very well with their policy initiatives. The core rate is about 1.9%. The Fed has a goal of about 2%, maybe a little above for the inflation rate, for the core inflation rate. Right now it's been pretty stable and stuck around the 1.8, 1.9% rate for the past 5 or 6 months. But we are seeing some core pressures building. We've seen the core inflation rate tick up in each of the past 4 or 5 months at a faster rate than it was a year ago. And we expect to see, a year from now, maybe 2 years from now, we'll see inflation right above 2% to 2.5% as those tighter labor markets push into the prices and push things up. So what ultimately does this mean for rates? If we're looking at interest rates here, the blue line here, that's your 1 year, which we put in as a representative of the short-term rates, which are very much tied to where the Fed has set their policy rate and will move according to what the Fed has. And that's why you see it stuck down there near zero since basically 2008, as the Fed has kept policy very accommodative throughout the entire expansion, trying to push us to a faster rate of growth. The orange line here, that's your long-term rates. That's your 10-year Treasury rate. And that's obviously much more volatile and much more determined by supply-demand factors than exactly what monetary policy is doing. Now, obviously, it's impacted by what monetary policy is doing, but it's much more driven by what's going on in the markets, who wants to buy these kind of securities, and where those things are going. In the past 2 years, you've seen a big downtrend for long-term rates. Obviously, the big jump there in 2012, 2013, that was what we call the taper tantrum, which was when the market reacted very strongly to the Fed deciding they were going to start to taper and pull back a little bit on the accommodative policy. But what you've seen in recent years has been a big influence from flight to quality. Despite the fact that we're only growing 2.5%, maybe 3% overall for the economy, that's still stronger than most of Europe, still stronger than Japan for sure, and China's been slowing down. And so as you've seen in the market is that people are saying, I really want to invest in a safe, solid security. I want to invest in the U.S. because that's still probably the best place to go, even if I'm only getting that 2%, 2.5% at the most rate. So we've seen a lot of downtrends in long-term rates, mainly impacted because of the flight to quality action that we've seen in the markets. Very recently, particularly because of the very good October jobs report and because of a lot of the commentary that we're hearing from some of the Fed officials, you've seen an uptick in both short-term and long-term rates. And that's because markets are now expecting the Fed to raise rates very soon, potentially as soon as next month. Right now, the market expectations are about 70% for a rate hike in December. You know, whether it's December, whether it's January, long run, it's really not that big of a deal. It's more that the Fed is moving towards a higher interest rate environment, moving towards a tightening cycle, and that's really what we're mainly concerned about. And that's what long-term interest rates are going to start looking at as well. We expect long-term interest rates to end the year about 2.5%, maybe 2.6%, and then go up about 50 basis points throughout 2016. It's a very gradual rise for long-term interest rates, ending 2016 about 3%. Keep in mind here that does also mean that short-term rates are going to go up quicker. We expect short-term rates to go up in line with what monetary policy decisions are, and so we do expect short-term rates to go up at a faster rate than long-term rates in the next couple years, which for those of us that are savers, we do appreciate that. One final slide I want to definitely point out here is our forecast for Fed rates. Obviously, we still feel the Fed drives the market. We still feel that the Fed drives where growth is going to go. Our motto is that expansions do not die of old age. They are thusly killed by the Fed and when they decide that they need to slow things down and that inflation is getting too rapid and things are moving too tighter from a policy perspective. As we have here into 2015, we do expect a rate hike next month, but we do expect 2016 to be very gradual. We're looking ahead, and we're not as concerned about when the ultimate rate hike is, but we're more concerned about what the path is for the next couple years. Can that have a big impact on the growth rates that we expect for the economy and on the growth rates that we expect for everything in the markets as well. For next year, we're expecting about 1 rate hike per quarter, which if you look at past cycles, back to the past 5 cycles, the Fed has averaged increasing 160 basis points in the first year. So we're expecting about 125, so a little bit less than what the current Fed forecasts are, but certainly a little less than what the long-term averages are for Fed fund increases, particularly in the first year, because the Fed wants to act very cautiously. They're still concerned about what's going on with the emerging markets and what's going on in China and those impacts from international concerns. And we still expect the Fed to act pretty cautiously in the near term, but then once you get to 17, you just see we have a big jump. We expect them to go back to the long-term averages of about 1 rate hike per meeting. They have 8 meetings a year. That gives you 200 basis points or 2% for 2017 as well. So we ultimately expect in 18 the Fed rates will come out to about 450. But we feel that this rate policy and this rate path that we expect for the next couple of years definitely does support growth. Just because the Fed raises rates next month doesn't mean we'll be going to a recession 6 or 12 months after that. Usually it takes about 3 to 4 years on average for when you start a tightening cycle. It's when you actually finally get to a slowdown in the economy and then maybe an ultimate recession. So that still means that for the next 3 or 4 years, we expect the economy to move in the positive direction. We do expect next year to probably be the peak for growth, but that could be pushed off into 2017 as well, depending on how slow they decide to raise rates for the next coming years. So that's the kind of synopsis. I feel the economy is going to have a modest acceleration into 2016 and potentially into 2017 as well, driven mainly by job growth. We still expect job growth to be about an average of 200,000 per month for next year, with the inflation rate kind of dipping down into the 4s. Usually you get dipped down to about 4.5, 4.4 at the lowest point late in expansion, and mainly driven by inflation going up a little bit and the Fed raising rates to slow down the economy for the next couple of years. That's what we got.
Thank you, Gordon. Well, does everybody here remember Rust Belt? That's where we are. That's where, for years, we've gotten called as the unperforming part of the U.S. economy. And what I plan on presenting here today is evidence completely to the contrary, that we actually are in a region, Ohio and the states surrounding it, that actually has performed very well during this economic recovery, not just along with the nation, but in many parts of the region in excess, better than the nation. Now, there'll be a test after the discussion here on some of these factors that actually indicate that this region is doing as well. And I'm going to show some charts here that I think you'll find interesting. In general, the Ohio, Indiana, Michigan triangle, if you will, has been growing spectacularly during the economic recovery. A lot of that's been manufacturing, but it's been diverse. And in essence, it is a function of the recovery in autos. It's also a reflection of very positive policies. For example, Site Selection magazine giving many of the states in this part of the country high ratings. Unemployment rates have been falling, and as we're going to see in a moment, the unemployment rate in Ohio and Michigan are their lowest in 15 years since the beginning of the millennium. That is truly extraordinary. If any of you remember the difficult years just 10 years ago when this part of the nation was clearly underperforming other areas. Hiring rates are strong. Payroll growth has been strong. We're going to take a look at some in-migration data for Ohio that indicates that Ohio is actually, in some regards, turning that around, attracting workers from other parts of the country and outside of the country. Manufacturing numbers, very strong for the region. And we continue to benefit from some very positive trends in terms of housing affordability. Okay, we're going to get a little bit more technical here now. This is an indicator of economic activity supplied by the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. It's on a state-by-state basis, and basically we're starting at the end of the recession, June 2009, and we're tracking how the different states are performing. And if you look at that dotted line, that's basically the United States. That's the United States average. And you can see clearly that Michigan is by far the fastest growing state in our region, one of the fastest growing in the country. Right behind it, not too far, is Ohio, and a little bit below that is Indiana. You know, again, three very manufacturing intensive kinds of states. But I think it's important to note, even though, as has already been suggested, that manufacturing was the first to get the recovery going, and it's kind of phased into other sectors, that essentially the sustained growth in these states indicates there was more than just the manufacturing. That growth continued, and actually we even widened a bit on the United States in recent years. In the triangle of Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio. On the other hand, if you take a look at some of the other states that border Ohio, Pennsylvania has been on par, actually a little bit slower than the United States. Kentucky's been more on par with the United States. And West Virginia, after basically tracking the United States pretty well, has dropped off quite sharply. For all practical purposes, West Virginia is in recession. And a lot of that is because of the very low energy prices, the issues, and the problems in the coal industry, and in essence, some challenges going on in that state. Or take a look at consumer confidence, and I think what's important here is that finally Midwest consumer confidence is tracking with the nation. If you look at before the previous recession, there was a gap. Clearly, U.S. confidence was higher than it was in the states that basically is not only Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, but also Wisconsin and Illinois. That's changed. The confidence is back to what it was about 15 years ago, and I would expect that confidence would continue to improve going forward. These are the unemployment rates. And again, first of all, what immediately should pop out is the extremely low unemployment rates in Ohio, 4.5%, Indiana in particular, but Michigan, 5.0%. Take a look at that chart where the unemployment rate was for Michigan at the beginning of the economic recovery, almost 15%. That has come down to 5% over the 15-year period, and now the unemployment rate in Michigan is below the national average. That is just incredible. And it indicates the great amount of economic growth that's happened in Michigan, certainly to the credit of the people of Michigan. I know we're in Ohio here, but they deserve, businesses in Michigan deserve a great deal of credit. Workers in Michigan deserve a great deal of credit as well. But Ohio, again, unemployment rate well below the national average. Indiana, you can see that Pennsylvania is not doing quite as well. Kentucky actually is shown some strengthening recently, some pickup of momentum. But West Virginia continues to lag again, and that recession in West Virginia is hurting labor markets. It's not just at the state level, it goes right down to the metro level. Here you have examples of important, some metropolitan areas, not all, but you can see that the general propensity is that these unemployment rates are extremely low, not unusual to see threes as the first digits for unemployment rates, and tremendous improvement by a lot of areas hit very hard. Take a look that Detroit is actually in this list now of low unemployment rates, and the lowest unemployment rate since the third quarter of 2001 in places like Detroit. Actually, Pittsburgh and Indianapolis, even though the unemployment rates are low, the rates haven't come down quite as much relative to their historical norm, but still at extremely low rates. This chart takes a look at employment growth since the end of the recession. And again, I think the first thing to do here is to focus on the U.S., which is the heavy black line, and which has been going up. It's about 9%, almost 9% now growth during the economic recovery. And here again, you can see that the job growth has been better in Michigan. It's been better in Indiana. Interestingly enough, it's been a little bit slower overall in Ohio. So even though the economy, the GDP part of the Ohio economy has been extremely strong, it hasn't been quite as good in generating jobs, but still a relatively solid performance, especially when you compare it to states that also have older infrastructure like Pennsylvania, which you can see there is considerably lower, and again, the West Virginia line, which basically shows the recession. All right, this is a little bit of repetition here. I think a little bit of coinciding analysis, but in the last 3 months, what this says is that Michigan and Ohio have been the strongest growing. You can see that West Virginia has been weak, and also what pops out here is the impact of the energy shocks to the middle upper part of the country there, areas where there was a lot of oil exploration. That basically has been hit pretty hard of late. Also some commodity type issues as well. You can see also that the southern part of the United States is slowed down a little bit relative to other parts. And again, I think this is largely a function of the drop in energy prices, also the very strong dollar and the impact that has on exports. And we'll talk about that in a second. This just breaks out the regions and shows where the jobs are picking up. So for all of you people looking for jobs here in the near future, go to the Midwest. You may also find jobs in the West and the South, but the East is underperforming, Northeast is underperforming. Okay, this chart may be a little bit difficult from this context, but basically it states that all the large metropolitan areas have been growing relatively solidly. The one exception would be Cleveland. Cleveland has not grown quite as quickly during this economic recovery, and I think that's worthwhile to think about, and maybe the policymakers should be asking why that's happening or not happening. This shows net in-migration and what's been happening recently relative to a period in the past, the 2000 to 2007 period. The green states are basically good news. There's a pickup of people on net coming in. So even though there still are demographic type questions in Ohio, we still have a relatively elderly population on average. What this chart shows is that we are picking up a lot of people coming into the state to get for jobs. We're right up there with some of the areas that also experienced the energy boom in the central parts of the country and in Louisiana. Obviously now things have changed, have shifted a little bit, but interestingly enough, even though the energy producing areas have weakened, Ohio has not. This is one of the reasons why it has not. This is the actual, what's happened to manufacturing employment since the end of the recession. And the first thing, if you could follow that dotted line, that black dotted line, that's the net manufacturing employment increase in the United States, only about 5% since the end of the recession. Actually, it's not that good. But if we look at the states in our part of the country, we have done tremendously well in terms of manufacturing jobs. And you can see in particular the impact of the auto industry in Michigan, but still very respectable and very strong growth rates also in Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. That heavy green line is basically the average of these states. The dotted green line is where we just include Pittsburgh as a part of Pennsylvania. It turns out that the eastern half of Pennsylvania is weaker economically than the western. And it so happens that at least on the manufacturing side, although Pittsburgh is not extremely strong, it's been holding steady, relatively steady. But in general, the region is extremely strong in terms of generating manufacturing jobs. In fact, net increase of 331,000 jobs, over 50% of the net manufacturing jobs in the United States were created in 3 states. That's tremendous, and I don't think that's a very well-known fact. Okay, now there's been some discussion, I won't say where, to the effect that the only reason that Ohio is doing well is because of its energy industry. And I think that this chart indicates that that's actually not true, that Ohio benefits more from lower energy prices than from higher energy prices. And this chart, again, a little bit tough to read, but on net, much of the region and much of the Midwest is benefiting from lower energy prices, both on the manufacturing side and, of course, on the consumer side. The consumers are benefiting from those lower costs, and they have more money left over to buy other goods and services. And as a note on that, in the most recent retail sales, that the actual nominal growth number has been soft, but if we want to adjust for that inflation, actually real consumption growth has been quite solid on a year-over-year basis. Exports, although very strong, have leveled off in the last couple of years. Again, our colleague will talk about what's going on in the international economy. Exports certainly an important aspect of the overall recovery in the beginning, but still small enough that it's not creating too severe a negative impact. Disposable personal income, again, very solid growth in all of the states, and pretty much in excess of the growth of the United States. So another positive economic statistic. The leading indicators point to solid growth. We maybe won't be the strongest growing state every time, but we're going to be up there going forward. Housing costs continue to be less volatile than the national average, which is in the black line. So during the rise, housing prices don't tend to rise as much in our region. By the same token, when they dip, they don't dip by as much. And finally, and this is an important factor for future growth, housing affordability remains extremely good in our region. So we can continue to attract people to come in here and basically become established much more quickly than more expensive parts of the country. Thank you.
And we have Mark Schweitzer from the Fed.
Excellent.
Yep, thank you. So I was asked to talk a little bit about international, and I am going to a little bit, but not too much. What I'm actually going to do is go through some of the issues that we see going forward. I should note that these are my opinions, not necessarily those of the Federal Reserve System, so forth. So what are the questions that I think are interesting at this time? So you saw two presentations, relatively optimistic. You know, economists are all happy these days. So what's up with all the nervousness? So we'll talk a little bit about where does nervousness come from. On labor markets, it turns out I got almost the same slide as George, and we didn't coordinate, but I'll show that very briefly and then go on and talk about whether that really is a tight labor market or not, because that's an important question. Then I'll talk a little bit about inflation and what we think about today's inflation rate. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about what the actual members who vote on interest rates are saying about interest rates. Very briefly, GDP, as Ben noted, it's often the first slide, so we'll skip that. I actually want to talk about this. So Ben was noting that there was core GDP. When I think about that, I think about what actually contributed to GDP growth in any given quarter. So there are a lot of possible little cuts up there. The yellow one is personal consumption. So that was responsible for most of the growth in the last quarter. If I add up all of those ones that are, there minus inventories, which is the blue one down below, that would have been 2.9% growth. So why would I add up everything except for inventories? I do that because inventories go up, they go down. Right now, there's a view that there was a little too much inventory accumulate, or that it wasn't ideal. So now retailers are adapting. When you see it down, the best thing is to predict that it'll be up next time. So it's very volatile. It doesn't help you. The underlying strength in the economy is indicated by those other bars, and so that says about 2.9% growth, and that's similar to what Ben was suggesting. So where does the nervousness come from? And so we have local nervousness, we have national nervousness. This is both a local and a national issue. So the first thing is we've seen a very sharp retrenchment in oil production, well, not so much production, oil exploration in our region. So if you're looking up there, you can see the Brent crude oil price, and it has dropped a lot. And that is, of course, great when you're a consumer. And Ohio, on net, has a lot of consumption going on in oil. But we're also a producer now. And that's actually been a good source of growth in many parts of the state. And that activity is associated with oil drilling rigs. And it turns out we have almost exactly the same picture if I was to focus on Ohio active oil rigs. They've all come down. Now, it turns out we're doing okay in this space locally because we actually have a lot of infrastructure needs, and so there's still a lot of activity on those fields, but the activity intensity is down. So that definitely is making parts of the country more nervous. Here's my big international slide. So the big deal for us, and at the Federal Reserve, I'm focused on policy that is designed for the U.S. We do, of course, pay attention to what's going on internationally, and past statements have noted that. The biggest factor for our growth is, how is the nominal broad, dollar, or how is the dollar faring? The dollar, counter to certain Tea Party notions, is rising. So it has been a rising factor in local areas. Now, I want to point out, and I think I've got the laser pointer here, maybe not so much pointing. So on the right-hand side there, you see the dollar goes up and you see net exports come down. And that's right. And on average, that is what happens. But you can see that the dollar can go up and it can be a little below average or it could be a little bit above. And it's not actually so reliable. If you go look at 2009, you can see that actually we had really pretty good net export growth during that time. So this is a worry. It's something we account for in our forecasts. It is not that terribly reliable of a predictor. Going back to that contributions, the main thing that's going to affect U.S. consumption is U.S. activity. And so I wouldn't be too worried about that. So thinking about what is the actual FOMC, and those are the people who are voting on the interest rates, what are they expecting to see? We have a chart here that shows all of their submissions. So Chair Yellen is there. The bank president in Cleveland is among those respondents. I can't identify which one's which. But for this year, ending the year, we're expecting, the committee's generally expecting growth a little bit above 2%. With a pickup for next year. That's actually quite consistent with what Ben was saying. Now, out there in the 2018 period, you're seeing that growth slows down a little. So this is designed to be a forecast based on optimal monetary policy. So we're saying what should policy try to produce? Out there at that period of time, you should slow down to a little bit of what normal growth would be. And it turns out normal growth is a very hard thing to estimate. So this is the slide that's almost the same as Ben's, so I'm going to skip this. It really is remarkably similar. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why labor markets are or aren't tight. So when I've talked to many groups, often people will say, well, aren't there a lot of people who've left the labor market? And there are. That absolutely did happen. So here what I'm going to do is U3 is the official unemployment rate. It's at 5% now. That's great. But what if I said, well, what about people who feel like the economy's been bad and they've left the market, they're discouraged? Well, I'll add them in, I get U5. That would raise our unemployment rate to 6.2%. What if I said, well, a really big issue, and I think actually a really important issue has been we've seen a growth in part-time employment. In fact, in part-time employment for people who say they would, prefer to have a full-time job. So let's include them. We're going to include them as half because those people on average work 20 hours and would like to work 40. So we'll include them as half. That raises the unemployment rate to about 6.9%. And if I want to be really, really expansive, and I want to say, well, let's throw in anybody who says they want a job. Now, sometimes people say, well, that's not everybody who isn't working. But my mom doesn't want to work. I don't want to make her work. She shouldn't work. So we want to focus a little bit on just sort of who wants a job. You add that in, you get all the way up to 8.6%. Now what I want to point out is I added in a lot of categories, and they will boost your unemployment rate. They boosted the unemployment rate before the recession. They boosted it in the recession. There is some movement there in relative terms, but basically since the recovery started, every one of these lines has been moving more or less in parallel down. So it doesn't actually matter so much which one of these you use. They're all actually telling you essentially the same thing. We're getting to a tighter labor market. Is the labor market tight? Well, the committee's forecast is that we should end this year with about 5% unemployment. They put together this forecast in September, so they had a lot of information on how we were doing already. So it's not remarkable. In fact, they've been forced to revise down their unemployment forecasts over time. But what you can see is that after a very steady decline in the unemployment rate, the committee is projecting that things are going to level out in unemployment. As a labor economist, I'm not entirely convinced of that, but what that is a statement that we're getting closer to a tighter market. And in a tighter market, other things are adjusting rather than the unemployment rate. The unemployed are already more or less absorbed when you're in that tight labor market. And then you're working on, I need to increase the hours of work that people are working in. I need to incent them to do that. I need to make it something they want to do. I need to bring people in from outside the labor market. Well, that again, I need to incent them to do that. I need to shift people from, worse jobs to better jobs. And all of that can actually happen in that environment to still support growth. So when I think about a tight labor market, one of the key signs is that wage growth is high. Wage growth is not high. Wage growth is about 2%. If I look back to 2000 to 2007, that was a period of time where we had relatively low inflation. Despite that relatively low inflation, either in a wage measure, and they clearly differ in what they look like, but either one of them is in the 3.5, even 4% range. We are stuck very much right around 2 right now. So I do not view today's labor market as tight. Is it getting close? Probably. So what about inflation? I'm going to add one extra line to Ben's graph. I'm not going to just think about core. At the Cleveland Fed, we also, and so you don't have to throw out food and energy over and over again and try to explain to the public, yeah, you don't need to worry about food or energy. That turns out to be a really bad argument to get involved in, so we try to avoid that. What you're trying to do with either core measure is actually give yourself a start for your forecast. And it turns out that the median CPI, which ranks changes in goods from the very highest to the very lowest and says, what's the middle one? That middle one is actually a better forecaster of 1 year out's inflation. So I like it as a tool to tell us where is inflation. Inflation is probably going to come back up towards that 2%. That's good because that's what the committee's forecasting. When I think about what rate of inflation, the committee wants to see a 2% PCE-based inflation rate. In CPI terms, the terms that most of us are used to working in, that's probably 2.25% to 2.5%, because the tool actually just gives you a lower inflation rate. So we are expecting inflation to head back up towards its target. It matters a lot that we are a long ways from it. And in fact, you can see that we've spent a number of years below the 2% target. So where are committee members expecting inflation to go? And I was trying to pay attention to Ben's figure earlier so I could check and see how it compares. So here is each and every member of the FOMC. So that's the 12 bank presidents and the governors, including the chair and vice chair. What are they predicting? Well, most all of them are predicting that rates ought to end up the end of the year. So this is as of in September, that they ought to end the year above where they are today. Because right now, our interest rates and the Fed funds rate market are, in the measured in basis points, always less than 25. So the vast majority expect that rates ought to rise this year, and that's going to be the open question at the upcoming meeting. The thing that I would note here is that the members of the committee think that rates ought to rise more slowly than in Ben's diagram. So one of the things that we think is in today's economy with the forecast that I've shown you, that the correct response would actually be a little less of a rate increase than recent episodes have been. So, of course, we are coming up on December. This will be the last FOMC meeting of the year, and the committee said, actually in determining whether it would be appropriate to raise rates, we would consider exactly the issues that I've talked to you about today. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to questions.
I thank the panelists. Can you hear me? I thank the panelists for their incredible analysis, and I would like to ask them whether they had any questions for each other.
So Ben, why do you think the Fed causes recessions? What drives us to do that?
I mean, I think that's taking some liberties with the words that I'm taking some liberties there, but we certainly feel that that slowdowns and changes in the economic cycle are driven by the policy cycle, and that's mainly what I'm trying to say is that as the Fed tries to as they get concerned about where inflation's going, as they get concerned about not getting too rapid of growth and too rapid of inflation, in the medium term, that they start to raise rates, and that ends up slowing down the economy by raising the cost of doing business, raising the cost of investing, all those kind of things that, they end up causing the recession by the actions that they make, I guess.
So putting that through the Fed filter,
Yes.
I would say, you want to think about, I think many ends of expansions have different causes, and rates can be part of that, and they have been in certain cycles. It's primarily when you have an inflation rate that's well above your objective. So, in the Volcker years, it's absolutely the case that the Federal Reserve was tasked and asked to bring down inflation, and it did, and that, had costs. I don't see today's environment as, such an easy parallel to that.
I have a question for Mark. What risks do you see in the issues, the problems in Asia and China, and what is the potential that could slow the U.S. economy here in the next year?
So it is one of the primary risks that we've been looking at. I would primarily focus on, so there are two effects, at least. There are a bunch of things going on. So when you see weakness in another country, that lowers our export possibilities. It affects the dollar as well, which can also, lead to weakened export possibilities for other countries that are not necessarily weak. There'll be substitution. Those things can have a fair amount of effect. That's why I showed net exports, though. It's not that terribly reliable of an effect. And so it's something that we view as a risk and rather than a core part of the outlook. We just sort of pull down the outlook some for net exports. The big deal happens when you start worrying about financial contagions. So if Europe or if Asia were to sort of contract very sharply, and that was to be reflected in our financial markets as a sort of significant shock, then that actually has a very strong effect on businesses activity levels, because then they can see higher risk spreads. So if it permeates into our economy and it affects our financial markets, then you get bigger effects. If it stays, there's relatively weakness outside, we're not going to export as much, it doesn't have as much of an effect on our growth.
I would ask Mark, as you did mention, our forecasts have higher rate hikes, particularly in 2017, as opposed to 2016 by the Fed. What is the main thinking about why it's different this time? What is the main reason why the policymakers would not raise as often as they have in the past cycles?
So the primary difference would be if you were looking, and you wouldn't have had the committee's SEPs in their projections. So these idea that the Fed would communicate, here's what our expectations are, here's what policy is in response to that, that didn't exist before. That is a new creation. So in past recession or past expansionary episodes, many of them had a period of time where inflation took off. If you looked at the inflation forecast there, you'll see that the committee does not expect that, with appropriate policy, inflation will take off. Without inflation taking off, there is no justification for raising rates more than what you see there. So if you actually sort of take the idea of lower inflation and put that thing into a Taylor rule or some similar rule, you end up with lower rates than what you're projecting, which I think are, reasonable, but they're based on past episodes.
I have a question for George. So, as our governor pointed out that it's not everything about energy in the last debate, you mentioned that we do have good numbers despite the drop in energy. Now, do we see that in the entire state, or do we see big differences between the southeastern part of the state and?
There are pockets that are, especially localities, that have strong energy dependence, obviously. That would be primarily in the southeastern part of the states, especially smaller type communities that especially benefited from the fracking boom, for example, and that obviously is slowing down. There are also manufacturers of equipment, energy exploration equipment, if you will, pipes even, and that kind of thing, that are being hurt. And we're actually seeing softer business equipment numbers, I think, in the nation, at least partly as a function of the slowdown in energy investment. So there definitely are those factors in play, but yet despite that, you've seen some of the numbers. There's still relatively solid employment growth in the private sector, in the service sector. Still in manufacturing, parts of manufacturing are still doing quite well. The auto sector, even today's industrial production report indicated that auto production is keeping up manufacturing overall and manufacturing and to some extent industrial production. So it's a mixed bag out there, but overall the state appears to be growing steadily through the headwinds.
Any other questions? How about we take some questions from the audience? Do we have a microphone that's going to be passed around? All right.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentations tonight. And I have a question that's really more directed towards Ben and George, but Mark, feel free to weigh in as well. Ben, you emphasized the strength of the labor market, the low unemployment rate, the growth in employment. And George, you emphasized the rebound in manufacturing, in Ohio and throughout the Midwest. But I wonder if perhaps you aren't a little bit over-optimistic. In terms of a strong labor market, there are several measures. And although there has been job growth, Ben, the employment to population ratio has not recovered. Now we can talk demographics and how there's been changes, but we're still about, we have fewer people that are employed than we did before, even though unemployment has gone down. And I won't get into the inside baseball definitions as to what the difference is, but the employment to population, the labor force participation rates worry me. George, you emphasized this growth in manufacturing since the bottom of the recession. But if we compare jobs in manufacturing in Ohio, let's say, to 20 years ago, what do we have? About 70% of the jobs we used to have in manufacturing today compared to 20 years ago. So we're certainly better off than the Great Recession. But have we really recovered all that much? So I guess my question, really directed mostly to you two, is are some of these comments about the strength and the recovery a little bit over-optimistic?
The first issue is that manufacturing is actually adding jobs, and that is something that was not happening last decade. So there definitely was a restructuring going on in manufacturing. It was moving from the older assembly line type manufacturing that you're referring to one that's actually more technology oriented today. And a lot of the employment growth is requiring higher skills than they did in the past. So there are some structural changes going on as well. Having said that, I think that you're correct that there is a sizable number of people who probably have dropped out of the workforce, people who were in manufacturing who weren't able to make adjustments. That is a structural problem. That is a lingering problem. And it's not to be papered over, but I think the important point is that Ohio now has found a growth trajectory. And with that growth comes different kinds of jobs, even in services, maybe lower skilled jobs as well, that could also absorb some of these workers in the next few years. Hopefully this recovery continues. Wages would continue to rise. More of these workers would find their way back into the workforce with some other, maybe in a different sector.
I would reiterate a lot of the points that George is making, but just expand it out to the national level. I think a lot of the trends that you're talking about the switching from the goods producing to the service producing is happening very strongly at the national level as well. I still think the optimism is there. Certainly there are some areas of concern, but I think there's always going to be a few areas that aren't going to be 100% perfect. I think, certainly you look at the labor force participation rate, and we haven't seen any uptick. We keep expecting an uptick in that, and it just hasn't happened. We're still at almost a 40-year low for labor force participation rate. But you are kind of at the nexus there of demographics and economics. And I think there's a lot of estimates there that half to maybe even upwards of 3/4 of the decline in labor force participation is structural, meaning that would have happened anyway. It would have happened as the population ages. There's been a shift from women away from the workforce back to living working out of the home and being stay-at-home moms because of the cost of childcare and because of just the improvement in overall economic expansion for families as well. The one area that still concerns me is the people that are long-term unemployed. I still think there's a high amount of people that are long-term unemployed that are probably tied to sectors that those jobs just aren't coming back, and those are the people I'm concerned about. But when you look at the total percent of the labor force that constitutes, it's a marginal amount. Sorry to say, but that's a marginal amount. Certainly, it does impact those folks. And I do think there needs to be better policies in place as far as job training and getting those people into other areas. Certainly that's a very contentious issue, but that's the one thing that I'm concerned about, and certainly different Fed officials are looking at long-term unemployed very closely as well. But when you look at the bigger picture, is what the bigger trends going on in the labor market and where things are going overall, it's hard to argue that's not the strongest we've seen since the 1990s. It's better than what we saw throughout what we're calling the jobless recovery from 2002 to 2007, in that range. We're in a much better state from a labor market perspective than we've seen since 15 years.
Yeah, I guess I'll just comment a little bit on that too. So I think I didn't show the long-term unemployment rate, but I could have shown that as well. That also would have been coming down. It is still elevated. It is worth paying attention to. The labor force participation rate is also coming down. That's a very interesting fact. I mean, I'd say, in fact, one of my colleagues is one of the lead authors on one of the studies that does say it's half to 3/4 of it is demographics. How is that? Well, it turns out the older workers are working more than they used to. But the rate of work of older workers is half of what they were, 5 years younger. So that rate actually declines pretty steeply. We're seeing the baby boom enter into that. That explains a lot of it. The other thing that is out there that I think is worth paying more attention to is young people don't work. There's some in the room. Teenagers are much less likely to work. Is that a reflection of a bad job market? Will they come in? Is that a change in sort of expectations for teenagers? I think it's probably more change of expectations. That turns out to be one of the key determinants for why the labor force participation rate is so much lower today. And then finally, Ben said we've been expecting it to tick up. Actually, the people who I work with are not expecting it to tick up. We view a cyclical recovery in the labor force participation rate as staying flat. And so we've actually already been experiencing a cyclical recovery in the participation rate because the numbers of people who are reaching older ages and the low participation rates of a growing generation give you a downward trend in the long-term labor force participation rate. So we're already seeing a little bit of a cyclical recovery in labor force.
Any other questions? Yeah, over here.
I think they've already spoke to this.
Here, just a second, so we can have it for the camera, so people who are on the streaming can hear you. Could you please use the microphone right here behind you? Thank you.
Right, I think this has been addressed to some degree, but some of the things you'll read suggest that people in the lower end, in terms of any increase in pay and that sort of thing, have not matched at all people at the higher levels of jobs, and so that there's a shift in who's getting paid by the benefit of a good economy. Could you express any more in what you read about in some places, a shift in who's getting paid in the economy?
So you might think I would try to duck that question, but actually I find that one really very important. I am a labor economist. I did my dissertation on income inequality, so I do pay attention to these things. We have seen relatively weak growth at the low end of the distribution, but it's worth noting that, the wages of the the median household are still lower than they were in real terms than they were at the end of the recession. So, well, before the recession, actually, at the end of the recovery. So there have been broad-based pressures on households. One of the things that you would like to see in a robust economy is for those wages to pick up and to be more substantial across the distribution, and that would be a sign of tighter labor markets. So I would say that, yeah, in my personal view, remember the disclaimer, not so tight yet.
Perhaps following up on your point right here, if we go ahead to 2017, 2018, will this recovery last? And I ask that question because it's my sense that consumption is driving the growth of GDP now, but household leverage is driving consumption instead of wage growth, or more importantly than wage growth. Is that the case or not? And do you think that's happening?
So I guess I'm happy to take that one on. So it turns out that probably the best way to think about household leverage is looking at the amount of money that households have to spend on paying their debt. That's called the debt service ratio. It's not one of the charts that I showed. That is back to, we started collecting that as a Federal Reserve system and as a nation in 1980. And the data starts to become good in 82. We are back to levels that are at that level. The U.S. consumer is way less leveraged than they were at any point in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. The amount of deleveraging that has happened to U.S. households has been immense. What that means is, for a long time, we were saying consumption growth wasn't as strong as it typically is in a recovery. And in fact, that's part of why this recovery doesn't look so strong when you compare it to the past one. That has meant that households have not re-leveraged. If you look at today's youthful populations, one of the big questions is, are they ever going to buy a house? And that matters, and a lot of builders are out there going, are they going to move out of mom and dad's house? We want to sell them something. No, so we really have seen a pretty incredible pullback on the amount of leverage. So, I mean, out of the many things you could worry about, that is not one I would put high on the list.
You're speaking to the level of leverage, but not the trend. And what?
Happy to talk about the trend, too.
Okay,
so
okay.
The trend came down very steeply.
Right, that I know that.
Well, through the recession,
okay,
went into the recovery, has only flattened out.
And
There is no uptick, especially if you actually put it in what is really the right term, which is debt service level, the amount of debt I have compared to the income I can fund. And that's despite the fact that a lot of households had a lot of, bad income shocks over that period of time.
And I think you also have to keep in mind that real incomes have been going up very strongly as well, because if you look at it, adjusted for inflation, which we haven't had much inflation, and then recently especially adjusted for lower energy costs, that the real incomes have been pretty strong, and that's where we're seeing a lot of pushback into spending because of the real incomes are doing very well.
yeah, certainly we got to, okay. My original question is, and you've probably answered it, okay?
I would just really...
If you project 2 or 3 years in the future, do you think the household leverage will stay flat, or do you think it will start growing again as it did in the last several recoveries?
I think a lot of that will depend on what happens in housing markets, because a lot of the decline in the debt in the U.S. consumer, actually consumers have done pretty good in reducing debt levels, and it's been on the mortgage side. They've cut those really down, and the debt service there has gotten quite low. So right now you have the mortgage debt service going down, and you've got the other debt starting to go up. So it'll be interesting to see the dynamics there. Frankly, it would be good if there was some more debt taken on to give some housing some stimulus here in the next couple of years. As long as it's a mortgage that where the prices are going to be sustainable growth.
Right here. Right here.
So we've all kind of been waiting for the Fed lift off because it's been accommodative for so long. So do you think traditional monetary policy would say the Fed lifts off, it begins contractionary, kind of slowing down the economy? Do you think that since the level has been low for so long, with expectations, once the liftoff occurs, this could actually increase growth in the short term versus kind of the stagnant equilibrium we've been at, because the expectation now that the rates are going to go up with still near zero rates and kind of the incremental increase, as well as like the decrease in variable rate mortgages, saw something on the BEA. So the households are less exposed to like variable rates, and it's more in short-term interest-bearing assets where it's increased, so they're less exposed there. Do you think we could see short-term growth kind of contrary to the traditional monetary policy?
I think that's where we are. I would agree with that to a certain extent. I don't think it's going to, just because they're starting to raise rates means we're going to get much stronger growth. But I do expect that the next year to 2 years is going to be the strongest growth that we've had in this entire expansion. And that typically coincides with a rising rate environment, because there's a reason why they're rising rates. There's a reason why, things are starting to talk about slowing down, is because we are at a faster pace of growth.
I'm not a big, so the story you told about raising rates causes more, implicit confidence in the economy. That is a very popular story, and I've heard many people tell me that. I'm not a big fan of that story. I don't think that on balance that's the primary effect. I think that data being stronger produces stronger expectations, produces rates. I think that's the right ordering. I would note, and I think it is important to remind people, that even after rates rise from the 17 basis points or whatever they were yesterday to, something around 50 basis points, that is not a tight monetary policy. That is still a stimulative environment. And, anyone who faced older interest rates definitely knows that is a low interest rate. So it's still a policy that is reasonably accommodative and just becoming less accommodative over time.
So I wanted to ask about the slowdown in China, and if there's potentially more there than what we've seen, and if so, how much does that affect us?
So, as regards China, you know, one of the hard things is trying to come up with a very firm measure for sort of what's going on there, and how much growth is there. I've seen various counts for that. I mean, some people think that the recent Chinese data is actually reasonably accurate given other indicators. There's no question that things have slowed down a lot in China, and that is probably one of the dominant reasons why we see oil prices being low today. It's why we see copper being low. It's why steel prices are low. I think, you know, most of the time, if you had a reasonably healthy construction sector and an auto sector that was booming in the U.S., you would expect steel prices to be pretty high. And the reason why they're not is because of China. So that said, you know, there are already a lot of indicators, a lot of signs that China's weak. There's no surprise there, but you know, there's always going to be a fair amount of uncertainty, if only because, you know, China is so new at experiencing these things. And I think it's always important to remember that China has grown incredibly. The growth that is experienced has been, you know, very large and has brought, you know, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So there are already huge changes that will slow. We've all been waiting and expecting it to slow. How quickly? Hard to say, and it's hard to even measure because, you know, for example, a lot of their employment statistics are based on employment in state industries. The largest sector of employment in China currently is outside of that. It's considered kind of other employment. You know, it's just a different, it's going to take them quite a while to really have all of the tools and statistics that we, you know, take for granted here.
There are some hard data, however, on China. China imports about $2 trillion. They did in 2014. That's quite a bit, and about $1 trillion of that was just to Asia, to other Asian countries. So they actually have a huge regional impact on the Asian economy. And in the last year, those imports have dropped about 20%. So that is actually a huge shock to the world economy. It's even a bigger shock to Asia. And I think that that's a reason for a lot of the slowdown in commodity markets that we're seeing right now as well. You know, that's lower demand across the board, whether it's purchases of rice or purchases of iron or purchases of energy. So again, I think that there are some hard numbers within the China data that indicate that they actually have a pretty significant slowdown. Their manufacturing data has also shown pretty much a recession. They've showed below 50 type readings. If you know ISM, that means declines, especially in total orders and export orders. And some of the consumer surveys also indicate that consumers expect lower income as well. So there definitely has been a shock in China.
I certainly don't disagree with that. I mean, one thing to note, though, is that as a fairly intentional policy, China is trying to become more focused on internal consumption. And in doing that, you're sort of shifting two services. And a lot of the trade data is focused actually on import and export again. So I bring in raw materials, I produce goods that are exported. So the one thing that, you know, there is, so people who think that there is still some decent growth going on in China are relying on the fact that the service portion of Chinese economy may be growing faster, and we just don't really have a very good measure of that. There's no question about the effects on commodities.
Any other questions? No? Well, this will be the first time that we are ended actually before time. Well, I learned a lot today, and I would like to thank our guests for giving us their views of the economy. I apologize for our international segment being a little bit slimmer this year. We'll beef it up next year. Well, I heard that recessions don't die of old age, that the Fed mercifully assists in their death. All right. I learned that Columbus is doing extremely well at 3.7% unemployment rate, which is great for a lot of our students that end up in the Columbus area. And hopefully students are convinced, especially in my principles course, that some of the tools, topics, terms we learn in class, such as consumption being 70% of GDP, labor force participation rates, federal funds rates, structural unemployment, that these things actually do have real-life application, and they do exist in the real world, not just in textbooks. I would like to thank my guests and thank the audience for insightful questions, and see you again next year.